The topic of this lecture is rent seeking. If you haven't already, go have a look at Mike Munger's video on rent seeking, which is to be found on the content page of your D2L. Okay, have you looked at the video? All right, let's talk about it. So, why does Mike Munger think that lobbying groups and special interests are a bit of a problem? I'll give you a minute to think about it. Okay. Well, Mike Munger's central point is that resources are wasted on rent seeking. And in some cases, so many resources are wasted on rent seeking that this defeats the purpose of government allocations in the first place. Mike Munger's view seems to be that resources spent on organizing and mobilizing people are a kind of waste to society. Now, his objection is not to all kinds of competition. Some kinds of competition, particularly market competition, are clearly good because they help consumers. In other words, competition is a kind of regulation. It's a regulation of business. Businesses have to serve consumers if they are going to succeed in a competitive marketplace. If you can take your business elsewhere, then the business has to try and serve you as best it can. Of course, in non-competitive situations, then the business will be considered a monopolist, and the business can frequently treat you in less than optimal ways. So some competitions are clearly good. If we didn't have competition, the government would have to step in and regulate monopolists, which it does when monopolies do arise. But there's other kinds of competition. These we might call non-productive competitions. Now, they're not non-productive or unproductive because it wouldn't be better at the end of the day that one person have money over another. You might perfectly sympathize with the idea of getting money into one person's hands over another. But the point is that organizing the transfer of resources from one person's pocketbook to another person's pocketbook is not costless, right? The transfer of resources is expensive, and in some cases very expensive, particularly when it involves a kind of competitive political process where large interest groups compete against one another to try and affect a particular distribution of resources or reallocation of resources, right? And from the point of view of society, if the interest group competition outweighs the benefits of redistributing the money from one person to another, then from society's perspective, the competition is unproductive. In fact, looking at it from the point of view of the course so far, you could argue that offering up a government contract or a grant can actually create a collective dilemma where there wasn't a collective dilemma before. In other words, you have a situation where perfectly rational individuals can, pursuing their own rational self-interest, end up producing an outcome that's irrational from the point of view of the group. That is to say, everyone, if they'd gotten together, would agree not to do this, right? Would agree to a different solution to the problem. But since they don't get together, and since they are fundamentally in competition with one another, everyone ends up worse off as a result of each individual's pursuing their own rational self-interest, right? So another way of putting this is that my best strategy as a rational strategic player here, given the odds of the game, is to spend a certain number of dollars, say X dollars, to get a benefit of a certain size. But the best strategy for N people, that is to say an indeterminate number of players, a number which could be N, is not to spend NX dollars, right? That would be irrational. Because the size of the benefit just simply does not justify spending NX dollars. So usually we think that government should solve collective action problems for us, and most of the course so far has been focused on showing how government can help us out of collective dilemmas that exist out there in nature, in markets, and in society in general. But it's worth noting that sometimes government actually creates collective dilemmas, and when it does that, it has to be careful that the costs are justified by the benefits that creating such a dilemma produces. Now, Munger doesn't really give us a hard and fast rule about when it is and is not worth it for society to try and give money away. And indeed, in many cases, it's hard to know in advance how many people will try to compete for a grant, or how many interest groups will mobilize, and how many resources those interest groups will spend in pursuit of real transfers of resources on the part of the government. But what the logic of rent seeking tells us is that interest group competition does cost real resources. Like I said earlier, transferring resources from Peter to Paul is not costless. And this is not just talking about the taxes required to raise money from Peter to give to Paul, and we're not even talking about the disincentive effects, right? The effect that you can have by taxing people. I'm sorry, let me restart that. You can have a negative effect on people's labor supply if you tax them too heavily. If you tax people too hard, they may just decide to stay home from work, not work, and not be taxed. And of course, so what happens is that people work fewer hours in response to higher tax rates. But we're not even talking about any of that. What we're talking about is the logic of rent seeking. We're talking about the fact that people will spend real resources in order to gain transfers from the government. And so from the point of view of society, sometimes that can be very wasteful, right? So one way of putting it is that all the resources that are spent trying to get a government benefit, you could imagine, could have gone to the people whose benefit you were trying to secure, right? So if you, for instance, would like to create the government to create a scholarship grant for underprivileged African Americans, it's possible that groups will mobilize in favor and perhaps even against such a policy. They will hire lobbyists, maybe. They will take politicians and powerful people out to lunch, maybe. They will spend money distributing pamphlets and sending mail to legislators to try to convince them to pass such a bill. All of that activity costs resources, right? Hiring people, printing materials, and so on. It's renting office space. All of that stuff costs money. And so we have to be careful that the money wouldn't be spent the money doing all of those things shouldn't just be spent on creating the scholarship in the first place, rather than being spent on lobbying government to tax other people to create the scholarship, right? That seems collectively irrational, even though from an individual point of view, the rational strategy might well be to try and lobby the government. Okay. Now, the flip side of this is that, and what Munger doesn't tell us, is that the measure of how well off society isn't solely a function of its total wealth. All of this makes a lot of sense if we just consider the aggregate welfare of society without looking at how that welfare is distributed among the various individuals within that society, right? Presumably most of us think that the distribution of wealth matters at least a little bit, right? So if 95% of people in the society own only about 5% of the wealth, or only receive about 5% of the income, and 5% receive 95%, we might think that no matter how rich those 5% of the people are, that is contributing to a high total welfare of society, or a high total income or total wealth of society, you might still think that the society as a whole, when taken in the aggregate, isn't very well off. 95% of the people seem to be relatively quite poor. So total wealth isn't necessarily the only thing we should be looking at. And so even if real resources are wasted in transferring money from Peter to Paul, that doesn't necessarily mean that society is worse off. It just means that total income is lower. Total GDP is lower. But total GDP is not the only way, and probably isn't the way we should measure aggregate welfare of a society. Still, despite this point, Munger's point, I think, is valuable. Given that we sometimes want to give money away, we should probably try to avoid creating unnecessary rent-seeking competitions when we do give this money away. We can make society equally well off, but for less money, and that, I think, is something that everybody can agree on.